here's some news as well. But this time, I'll say let's go to election. I'll say in 2026 election, which I would say have Georgia and also Wisconsin. If it's Georgia, I would say now they have, I would say, won the district election in Georgia. However, also Democrats also won, I would say, Wisconsin election, but I would say it's a Wisconsin Supreme Court election. But I would say what I was gonna say today, I would say it's not exciting. So it's not really a news because I would say Democrats are doing really well in special elections. And also another race, I would say that they held in 2024 presidential contest, which I would say their record and also their votes, I would say it's pretty clear now. But also during this time, I would say during the Trump era, which I would say the Tuesday was a very good night, and also in Trump era. However, if you look into Georgia, which I would say quite swing state, which is Georgia, which they note as I'd say their best Trump era's over performance, I would say in a special congressional election, I would say all across more than 3 dozen races. And also, if it in Georgia, I would say if you look at back onto a Tuesday night, I would say which I was gonna say a most watched contest. I would say the election, which a former, I would say, former rep majority. I would say Taylor Greene, which I would say on a 14th district in Georgia. I would say she has resigned. And she also has a profession herself. She also has herself as a critic of late. And also there were some questions, I would say, on the Iran war that I would say Taylor Greene might hurt Republicans, which for the candidate that they win on a Georgia on a district election, which I'll say the Republican Clay Fleur also won the race as expected, which I'll say in a district, I'll say that Donald Trump won by 37 points in 2024. And also for this time, I'll say the votes are near, I'll say all the votes, but I'll say the Clay Fleur, by the way, also winning, but I'll say less than 37 points, but I'll say I think less than on 12 points, but I'll say 25 over performance. I'll say on a Democratic candidate, which I'll say Sean Harris, also Democratic candidate for a, I'll say for Georgia district election as well. And let's go to, I'll say, Wisconsin, which I'll say currently there have been some elections on a Wisconsin Supreme Court election in the state of Wisconsin, which I would say the Democrat, I would say Chris Taylor has won a seat in Wisconsin, I would say Supreme Court, and also, which this time I would say will expand liberals, I would say in the majority, I would say on the battleground of a elections in Wisconsin. Also, Chris Taylor, which I'll say also a state's appeal court judge. I would say he also a former Democratic legislator, which I would say have secured more than 10 years on the court. I would say over the conservative in Wisconsin. The conservative are Maria Lazar, which I would say the appeal court judge who also worked in a Republican former governor, which I would say Scott Walker's administration, which I would say in the past as well. And also, I would say on Chris Taylor on the election race, when they have, I would say on this election, I would say has a victory in the race, I would say for the retiring Justice Rebecca Bradley. For the seat, I would say what it means for a liberal, I would say they will have a 5-2 edge, I would say on the swing state, I would say on the highest court. And also, after a Taylor wins in the Wisconsin Supreme Court election, will be putting us in the majority of a outreach for the conservative until at least 2030. And also, if you look at back, I would say on the liberal candidates, I would say in Wisconsin Supreme Court they have won 4 straight in Wisconsin, and also as well as I would say on the last 6, and also back in 2017 as well, which mostly are Democratic aligned candidates, which I would say they have won 19 of the last 24 statewide race in Wisconsin, which I would say Democratic do the best, I would say, on the special election as well on states, especially I would say on the blue state and also I would say highly swing state, which is sometimes Democrat can won this race, which is I would say especially on this current Trump's second term as well. And that's it for the election for Georgia and Wisconsin, and that's it for the news today as well.